On to our speaker today, our guest speaker. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Andrew Williams, who is our clinical director for the Southwest region and the Southeast. Andrew is also a practicing geriatrician in Dorset. Welcome, Andrew, and thank you very much for leading us through this.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to talk. So I think I'm going to talk to you today about criteria to reside and how we can try and change the focus of criteria to reside from that initially came through with wave 1 of the pandemic as being a little bit of a kind of must do into a quality improvement tool, primarily to help you with your work as well, the Alliance 16, looking at how we can reduce length of stay and use criteria to reside as a tool for improving patient care and patient flow. So if we start off with, wait 2 seconds. I can't see the slides because everyone's being admitted. So if we just wait, that's brilliant while people have finished joining. So what we need to do really is start off with the hospital discharge service. So this was the policy that came out in August of last year. It feels a long time ago now, I think August of last year, about discharge to assess. And I think I've gone back to this because you can't think about doing discharge to assess and criteria to reside separately. For discharge to assess to work, you need some criteria by which we all accept is the time people need to leave hospital. And for criteria to reside to work and be flagging up people who are ready to leave, there's no point in saying, can we change things and flag up people being ready to leave hospital, but then they don't go anywhere for 3 weeks. And all that work we need to do with our clinical colleagues to get them using criteria to reside only is going to land and only going to be effective if actually the what happens next bit happens. So for me, I'm now going a little bit off topic, but we can't think about criteria to reside and discharge to assess separately. They're all part of the same policy and implementation. And in fact, criteria to reside really came out as part of the hospital discharge policy and operating model document that came out last August. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So I'm sure you've all seen this. This is the Home First strategy came out of that document. It's a really busy slide, but I think it's just worth talking through it. So at the top, in the roof of the house, is that work about pathway 0, 1, 2, and 3. So that very much that home first philosophy about what do we need to do to be getting people going home first, and home being the default option for discharge from hospital, not going somewhere else. What we then got going across the screen in are the 9 changes came out the Local Government Association High Impact Changes model about ways of working that we need to have in place as systems to support the operation of home first and discharge to assess. What we need to do is have that safety netting in place, and then underneath that are the building blocks. So what are those things that we need to have happening in healthcare to make criteria to reside, discharge to assess and home first work? If I just go through those, because they are all quite interlinked. So those early morning board rounds, so board rounds that work so that everybody in the team and on the ward and patients know what's happening that day and what we're doing for discharge for that patient. The use of criteria to reside that Claire I'm going to talk about. An afternoon huddle, so again that's the catch up about where are we with discharges and what's happened today and progress chasing that. 2 questions, 2 issues. One about the 4 questions for patients and what matters to you. So why are we got people in hospital? Why do they want to be here? And what is it that they want hospital to address rather than what questions are we trying to fix for them in hospital that isn't necessarily what they want us to be doing? Some practical issues around expected dates of discharge, medication and transport that are going to be covered in further issues. Criteria discharge, I'm sure Liz is going to come and talk to another of these sessions. Getting away from doing lots of assessments in hospital, so the functional assessments for discharge being the minimum that's needed to get that person out of hospital safely, not doing lots and lots of assessments in hospital. And then the last 3 are really kind of thinking about discharge from when you come in, so having front door teams, a frailty service, and trying to think about discharge issues for patients when they come into the hospital rather than at the end of a process when they're ready to leave and it takes people by surprise. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So again, this is just what do we need to have in place as a system to make discharge to assess work well. I'm not going to go through all of this, but it just some things that we need to think about have our systems got it in place. So that the philosophy of home is best and home first, clearly, and I think this is why we're all here today, about some system leadership that's very positive and coherent and how we're moving things forward. Thinking about discharge as part of a multidisciplinary team thing rather than just delegating it to individual people and thinking about discharge from the time people come into hospital. So there's lots of other parts there, but I think those are the key bits we need to put in place to start making the discharge assess work properly. So go on to the next slide, please. So these are some of the key messages about discharge to assess. So the first one is really, really clear, and this is the reason for today's topic really is, once the person meets the criteria to reside, they must be discharged as soon as they are clinically safe to do so. And I would draw everyone's attention to those words, clinically safe and as soon as. So it's not saying they must go that day, and there will be people that don't meet the criteria to reside where it's clearly appropriate or that they need to stay in hospital a little bit longer, but that should be the default setting about the criteria to reside are the point at which the discharge should happen. And we need those criteria that everybody signs up to understand, so to start planning that. We're not going to be making long-term assessments of care needs while in hospital. We've stopped the discharge, we've stopped the detox, which we're all very comfortable with. Home is the default pathway, and then this issues around 95% of people should be going home to the usual place of residence, either on pathway 2 or pathway 1. So very much this home first philosophy. And with that, as you know, there was the short-term funding that we had for wave 1, then we had from September, and now we've had new funding agreed from April for 6 weeks for the next 3 months, and then 4 weeks beyond that. So go on to the next slide, please, Mark. So that was just saying the 588 million. So really clearly, the default option is home. Pathway 2 and pathway 3 are therefore really small numbers of people where home cannot be actioned for that individual at that time. We talk about the single coordinator, and I think lots of us haven't got systems yet, and talking to system colleagues around South East and South West, not sure we've all got those system coordinators in place as we should do. But understanding what should happen, and people go home on a pathway that's right for them with those longer term assessments happening in their own home. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Just some links to the policy, not necessarily to talk about now, but just so you've got those for the handouts. So can we go on to the next slide? So sorry, can we just go back one? So just thinking a little, the one that says origins and purpose, sorry, we seem to be going, that's brilliant. So the criteria to reside were there really about a response to wave 1 of the pandemic, and post that and where we are now, what we're trying to do is trying to use the criteria to reside as an improvement tool. So initially they were designed to help organisations understand which patients in their beds and why they were there, and what we could do about getting a system response to discharge and flow and stopping some of those people being stuck in the system. The plan, and it didn't always happen that way in every organisation, but the plan was very clearly this should start with a clinical conversation about why is my patient in hospital, do they meet the criteria, and then that information should flow, but that information should be captured at that daily board round in the morning. It was not intended that there should be a greater clinical burden, and a lot of the kind of issues that came out about this about talking about information burden, because actually if we're doing clinical care well, we should be reviewing everybody at a daily board round and deciding why they are in hospital and whether they need to be there or not. So there was an information requirement to submit the data as part of the discharge requirements, the discharge policy, and that was an appropriate thing for NHS England to be doing as part of a level 4 pandemic. So it was right that the centre did demand this information on a daily basis because it needed to know. Just to say, there were also some community criteria to reside that came in afterwards, and this was really trying to use information to think about system discharges and flow. And I think this was a real kind of philosophy change, because previously the only information we had in systems was about our detox. So when we were thinking about what do we need to do to improve flow now, systems were in trouble, 4-hour pressures at the front door, the only people we looked at, we knew information about why they were still in hospital, were those that were already stuck. With criteria to reside and discharge to assess, what we're saying is we should know that of every patient rather than just those that are really stuck in the system. So a complete kind of mindset change, rather than just focusing on those who are causing big problems, to be thinking about we should know why everybody is in a hospital bed and what their next step is for their discharge, who does need to be there and who doesn't need to be there, which was before criteria to reside, was not really part of our day-to-day working and information recording in trust. We just really focus on those delays and those people that were stuck. Can we go on to the next slide, please? I think to put it in context, we do need to recognise that when Criteria to Reside came out, there was quite a lot of bad press and unhappiness caused among clinicians. This was a tweet from David Oliver, and he wrote an article in the British Medical Journal with the idea that this was eroding our clinical judgment as clinicians, or that somehow some dark force was going to come and remove people from hospital who didn't meet criteria to reside, even if they had a very good reason they needed to be there, and that was going to be done against clinicians' best judgment. So go on to the next slide, please. And again, there was some stuff from Martin Werner. So these were two very influential, for those of you who don't know, these were both previous national clinical directors who are kind of medical opinion makers who voice these concerns in medical journals and in Twitter. So that, were these criteria going to be rigidly enforced, leading to performance management, and was that going to change our ability to manage patients safely and erode our clinical judgment as clinicians? And so there was quite a lot of bad feeling generated about criteria to reside. I think putting that in context, and if we go on to the next slide, please, that we need to recognise that criteria to reside were produced really, or the discharge guidance and the criteria to reside, the use of them, produced really quickly in wave one of a pandemic. And having talked to people involved in that, and I know we have just seeing some of the chat, this was done really quickly, and we were doing this at a time, or they were doing this at a time in wave one of the pandemic when we were seeing scenes from Italy of, you know, marquees in hospital car parks, and we were really thinking there was going to be a real issue about capacity in the health service and in hospital. So it did feel like an appropriate response to a level 4 clinical incidents, but was done very quickly. And with lots of the COVID guidance that came out, an awful lot of guidance and an awful lot of policy came out really quickly, without necessarily doing that hearts and minds stuff about normal policy changes and how we implement things. So it came out via an operational route. There wasn't really time for lots of explanation and lots of engagement activity. It was needed to make discharge process happen. It was right that there was a mandated daily data return because the centre needed to know what was happening given the urgency and size of the situation. So lots of things that created bad feeling were a product of the situation and were the right response at the time, but did generate bad feeling among clinicians and other people. And I think to make criteria to reside work now, I think we need some honest conversations at a system, a trust level, engaging with clinicians to recognise some of the things that didn't happen well, to accept them, and then to say, but we're in a different place now and we're doing things differently, rather than to ignore that stuff that happened. So I think there is a bit about how do we acknowledge that, how do we have those conversations and say it was the right thing at the time, we're in a different place now, it's still the right, there's still the right criteria to be using, but how we use them will be different, and we're in a, so we just need to think differently for how we are and what the world we're in now is. Hopefully we're not going to go back to another level 4 incident and all those pressures on acute beds. So it does feel we're in a different place where we can use them in a positive way about thinking about flow and who's in hospital. But I think we do need to recognise there were some issues that were a product at the time, and just to be honest about that. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So alongside those negatives, there were some quite positive things. It did help reduce some unwarranted variation. It did help making decision making and benchmarking, and for the first time we had an ability to look between different organisations and what was happening. And a number of organisations felt that it did get clinical engagement, it did make them think differently about discharge, it did give greater clarity around decision making and what was happening, and had lots of benefits for patients about people no longer staying in hospital inappropriately long periods of time. So why is that patient here? Do they need to be here? Not necessarily saying they don't need anything more to be managed in their health condition, but does that need to be in an inpatient setting? Can we go on to the next slide, please? So again, I think it's just really those reflections that it was perceived that there was a data burden. It was perceived the data was inappropriately collected and not necessarily accurate. I think that reflects systems within organisations, and in having done quite a lot of work in South East and South West, particularly in the South West, and gone round trusts and tried to have those conversations about how you're using criteria to reside. Even last week, I went into an organisation and talked on it. Was looking at a board round, and the ward manager, the matron, and the two consultants looking after that ward had not heard of criteria to reside. So some of this messaging is still not getting out there. That the trust were submitting criteria to reside data, but it was very much an IT only issue, and so there was not great clinical engagement because it said, well, this doesn't match with what's going on with our patient. So when organisations didn't get it right and didn't start it at the beginning about it being a clinical process and a clinical data recording, then things went wrong and it became an IT task, and people then said, well, it's not reliable data, why are we looking at it? So to get it good and be useful, it does need to be clinically led at the beginning. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Having talked an awful lot around it, going to the point now about talking about what are the criteria to reside. I'm sure you've all seen this in the guidance. So this is the page out of the guidance that just has that, the logo and the backing of the Academy of the Medical Royal Colleges. If we go on to the next slide, please, just in a more readable format. So these are the acute hospital criteria to reside at present. There may well be some further updating of these that comes out, but these are those that exist at present. So if I just talk through those, clearly some of them are really appropriate, being on IT or critical care, requiring oxygen, requiring intravenous fluids. So some about treatments can happen in hospital. News score used as a measure of physiological upset. So how unwell is somebody? Is that a good clinical marker? About people with diminished level of consciousness. So where their news score might not necessarily reflect that. Acute functional impairment in excess of home or community care provisions. That's a recognition that some people need to be in hospital for some of their care aspects because there isn't that care out in the community at the moment to manage them. Last hours of life, requiring intravenous medication more than twice a day. And then 3 at the bottom there about time after complex surgery or other invasive procedures where they may just be there because they need monitoring and close monitoring, possibly needing intervention, where the risk of something happening is high enough that they should be in a closely observed position where they can be seen 24 hours a day and a quick response happen if needed. So looking at these, apart from the one about acute functional impairment in excess of community care provision, they all, I think, designed to be deliberately binary. So they're not, there's no interpretation to them. You either meet the criteria or not. So you're either on oxygen or not on oxygen. Your news is low, your news is high. There's a time after surgery. Clearly the world we all work in is not that black and white and has shades of grey in it. But in terms of trying to get some criteria, I think being deliberately binary is an advantage because it makes it obvious people either meet or don't meet them. So there isn't an interpretation. And to me, I think we're trying to have a conversation a little bit is about the old terms, and we all used a slightly different term, different organisations. So in my trust, we use medically ready for discharge, medically fit for discharge, medically optimised for discharge. But my medically fit was different to your medically fit, was different to the consultant on the ward next door's medically fit, and was completely different to another hospital. So this is trying to get some of that variation that we had to be reduced and be able to know what we're comparing with what else. So trying to do some of that benchmarking work and having a greater degree of understanding about this isn't open interpretation. These are deliberately binary. You either meet or don't meet these criteria. This is a slide that one of my colleagues, Jyoti Nipani, I think is on the call, has done. I think it's just a really good way of thinking about these, about chunking up. So the 4 headings at the top are how they get reported nationally. Thanks for putting this slide on. So about physiological upset, about therapeutic interventions, about recovery and about function. So about trying to get people to go through that checklist in their head about, so this misses out the one about critical care. So we've gone down from 11 to 10 now, but try to think about for each patient, why are they here? Is it about physiological upset? Yes, no. If it isn't, is it because they're having therapy that can only really be easily delivered in hospital? Yes, no. Is it about, if no, is it about the recovery from something that where they're still needing to be managed in a hospital setting? Yes, no. If not, is it about their function and whether that can be managed in the community setting or not? So about last hours of life, about functional impairment, or about reduced level of consciousness. So I think this is a really good way of trying to get people to think through. And for me as a clinician, when I see a patient, when I'm talking about them on the board round, how do I talk through this? what's my thinking about why this patient still needs to be in hospital, and how do I record that? Can we go to the next slide, please? Just to say, there are, sorry, 2 seconds. For those of you that work in community hospitals, and I work part of my time in one, there are a different set of criteria to reside for bedded settings in the community. So this is whether they are for any NHS facility, NHS funded facility, whether this be a community hospital, whether this be healthcare funded beds in a nursing or care home. And these are the top 2, I think, are less easy to be binary about. So I do recognise that, about highly dependent and increased dependency. So just talking through those, the highly dependent one is about people who are still needing care over a 24-hour period of time, or where they need a significant number of interventions through the day that require a high number of people. So in reality, in the world that we work in, probably unlikely that we would have the facilities and the support available to manage those people in a community setting. The increased dependency, I think, is trying to differentiate those that still need to be in a bedded setting for those that could be managed in the community if the resources were there. So this is people who are, and I hate the term, but not back to baseline. So a high level of dependency, still needing rehabilitation, but we're then still expecting a recovery, but still needing more support than their normal level of support. So they may have had a package of care beforehand, they may have come from a care setting beforehand, but not back at the level where they could return to that setting without extra support. The others, end-of-life care, again, is recognising that lots of end-of-life care happens in community hospitals, and that's a very important function and completely appropriate. The one about waiting for information from acute trust appeared in the guidance. From what I've heard, is going to come out the next version of guidance, because it's not been used terribly well, but it was a worry that may be an issue. And medically unwell, clearly people who are there who become unwell or are there in the level of acuity different community hospitals manage just vary a lot from setting to setting. So recognising some people are there because they're unwell. And lastly, those with no plan, so where somebody's arrived and there hasn't been a multi-clinician decision as to what should be happening next with them. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So accepting we've got the criteria to reside and saying we are all here trying to improve patient care. How can we use them as a tool for good? How can we use them for quality improvement? To me, I think coming at it from that idea that they are a standardised national attempt at medically fit for discharge. So, as I said earlier, trying to reduce that variation between people and what we all think is medically ready for discharge. I think it then allows you to then think about looking at unwarranted variation. That's in terms of our improvement activity. Isn't that what we're all trying to do? We're all trying to drive out unwarranted variation between systems. So if there is a variation and it can be explained, then that's great if there's a good reason for it. But it's that unwarranted variation between systems. And I think that happens in 2 ways. So one is between hospitals or between healthcare systems, and often this can be about what community support there is or what facilities there are to support a discharge out there. So a couple of years ago, I did some work looking at community services to support acute hospital flow, and went to a community provider that was commissioned by 2 different CCGs and supported 2 different acute hospital trusts. One, and we're looking at their respiratory services in the community, one had 2 respiratory nurses, the other had 17. So this one organisation was running really disparate services. Clearly, if you're the acute hospital respiratory department being supported by the team with 2 community respiratory nurses for your patch, you're going to have a very different level of being able to support people in the community than those with 17. So some of this is about that unwarranted variation, that's about what's gone on, what services are being commissioned, trying to spot those gaps, what could be done differently in the community. The opposite of that, I think, is we all recognise that within hospitals there is a lot of unwarranted variation within a trust about, as clinicians and teams and wards, how we behave, how we think about risk, how we manage that risk, and how we, so recognising that. And so I have moved hospitals now. I used to work in a hospital where we had ward-based consultants. We had 2 consultants in the same specialty with a ward each, and consistently year on year there was more than a difference of a week in their length of stay. Clearly they both can't be doing things correctly in terms of flow and length of stay. So how do we start to record that data? How do we then start having some supportive conversations, but recognizing where we are and saying, not that someone is right and someone is wrong, we're all human beings, but how do we recognize that? How do we then start to say, how can we think about doing things differently? How can we change things? And then I think if we, going on as a quality improvement tool, if we start to think about criteria to reside as the reasons people need to be in hospital, then should they become the criteria to admit as well? So if somebody is in an ED or coming in as an emergency admission and don't meet the criteria to reside, then should we be saying, actually, these are the kind of people that we should be able to support in an alternative setting? Could we manage in the community? Could we see them in an SDEC facility and then get them back to their own home? What do we need to be doing differently rather than admitting people who don't meet the criteria? So not say nobody should come in if they don't meet the criteria, but how can we use them to get people to think differently and think about what is the purpose of this admission to hospital? Why is this person still in hospital? Why do they, what the next step in their care needs to be only happen from a bed? I think of them, and the way I describe them to my clinical colleagues is they're there as a clinical guideline. So I don't think we're saying you would never admit anybody or everybody who doesn't meet the criteria to reside must leave today. I think we're saying there will be some people that don't meet the criteria to reside where it's clearly appropriate they come into hospital or stay in hospital. But if I'm challenged as a clinician, I should, if I deviate from any clinical guideline, I should be able to say, I recognise I'm deviating from this guideline for this patient. This is why. I should be able to explain my reasoning and justify that. And equally, if I am somebody who deviates from that guideline much more frequently than somebody else, then I should be able to explain that why. So I would say, as a geriatrician, probably doing a falls clinic, I see lots of people who I don't aggressively treat their high blood pressure. I think I can justify if challenged, well, hang on, Williams, why are you not complying with this guideline? So I see these people, this is why an individual patient level, and this is why my numbers by looking something like even someone else's. And I think the same goes for criteria to reside. So we're not saying people should meet it 100% of the time, but we should be able to explain why and answer that question. And I think that, to me, when I have conversations with my clinical colleagues, the question I come back to is, so if you feel this person doesn't meet the criteria to reside and they still need to be in hospital, what services do you think need to be placed in the community to feel it's safe to discharge that patient who doesn't meet the criteria to reside? So using it to try and work out where the service gaps are and what you could be doing differently to think about it. So what it may be, it is saying there is no community service X. It may be saying, actually, as an acute hospital, we need to think differently about how we do things. So as an example, I think lots of us are quite good at doing same-day emergency care to prevent admission, and quite good and quite comfortable seeing people in a clinic setting and organising some rapid investigations, CT scans and investigations that day or the next day, and seeing them as an alternative to admission. My impression is lots of organisations I spend time with is we're not good at doing that at the back end. So once somebody's in, we'll keep them in, or they need to wait 3 days for a CT scan, and but could we be thinking differently? So not necessarily to say all those services should be provided by the community. Some of them is about thinking differently about, can we think about how we provide that service differently as an acute hospital? So we are able to say, this person needs a scan, it's going to take a couple of days, and I'd like to see the blood test in a couple of days. Hang on, I can do that. I can use a virtual ward setup. I can bring them back to a post-discharge ambulatory clinic. Those answers will be different, but it's about recognising we need to do some things differently rather than just saying everybody should be going at the moment. So what do we need to be doing differently to be able to support those people who don't meet the criteria to try to be able to go? Not so they don't need more investigations, more sorting out, more treatment, but it just doesn't need to be in a bed-based setting. And I think we have done that in some settings really well. So some places do it really well for managing COPD. Heart failure, I think, has changed massively from when I was a junior doctor, where people sat in hospital for weeks on being treated with heart failure. And now, once that diagnosis is made, we've got really good community heart failure teams who'll follow people up, who'll titrate their drugs, who'll monitor them really closely. So we've got models that are there. We just haven't got it applying everywhere. So what do we need to think about doing differently to allow those discharges to happen? Not they should all be going today, and without the service being in place. So how can we think differently, and how can we use the criteria to reside and those to recognise those gaps in the service, and then what do we need to do to fill those gaps? Can we go on to the next slide, please? This is just I'm doing a flyer here, I'm sure, for another talk. So one of the other A16 talks is about using the recently published Royal College of Physicians, Royal College of Nursing ESIS modern ward round guidance. So coming back to the beginning, criteria to reside only works if you've got a really good ward and board round process. So you need to think about this. So just to be aware, sometimes it is about doing things differently. It is about job planning, about making people have the time to be able to do things. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So this is my attempt, rather clumsily, to think about unwarranted variation. That we have a period of time in when patients are unwell and everyone accepts they need to be in hospital. We often used to have a time historically when they were delayed transfer of care, and in between that there was some clinical variation about my level of risk taking versus my colleagues and where we sat and what we did. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So these are some of the things I hear back from colleagues about why they're different. So I work down in Dorset and we've got a really elderly population. So when someone challenges my length of stay, I say, oh, we've got a really frail elderly population. They come in, they're much frailer. They all need to be in hospital. Other colleagues say, oh, we work in a much more deprived area. Our patients present later and are more unwell when they come in. So that's why they need to be in hospital. Or people say, oh, well, we're struggling with primary care in our patch. We've got some really limited primary care services. So people present later. They're not saying had the same support in the community. And we use those as reasons why our length of stay is different. I think all those things are covered by criteria to reside. We're saying that's great. Those people are unwell. They need to be in hospital. They meet the criteria to reside. So we're not trying to change that. If we go on to the next slide, we always the other issue I would always raise when someone challenges my length of stay is say, oh, used to be better when I had a ward-based social worker. It's all our local authority. It's our problems with our CHC process. We don't have enough therapists. The change from the old detox to discharge to assess has changed that. And so once people are ready, they should be leaving. So we can think about doing the criteria side, look at that beginning bit and give some standardization. D2A and the D2A funding means we shouldn't have those same issues about delayed transfers of care we used to have. So the beginning and end bits we're addressing, and I think next slide, please. What that leaves in the middle is that that unwarranted variation. So I think, as I said, that sits in two ways. One is the system bits around community services, what's being commissioned for out hospital care in one area to another, and the other bit is that bit, as we said, about that risk averseness and that medical model. So as a doctor, I'm the most important. Everybody must stay in. They need to be in here in hospital. They're clearly unwell, and I can convince myself they all need another test to be done. And if I do enough tests, I'll find some problems, and that allows me to say, look, everyone's in here appropriately. But it's about, as I said, what do we need there to be for you to feel safer to discharge these patients? And to me, this is the way in to have those conversations about addressing that unwarranted variation. Can we go on to the next slide, please? And I think along with criteria to reside is how do we get clinicians engaged in flow? So clearly I work for ESIS, I'm interested in this. I'm sad and nerdy and I apologise, but how do we change that mindset? So when there is a decision to be made, the default is always, I think about patient safety. If I'm not sure what to do, I keep that person in. And each of those single decisions might be appropriate, but you add all those up for a patient and a patient journey, and they can stay in a really long time extra in hospital. They have some really real harms that happen from deconditioning, and we have lots of people that well-motivated clinicians thinking about patient safety are making decisions about. But the consequence of all those things are they spend weeks in hospital, they decondition, and actually their chances when they're frail and elderly before they come in or getting back to their own home is much lower at discharge. So how can we reduce that risk? How can we think about safety netting virtual wards so that when, as a clinician, I'm not sure what the next step is, whether I need to keep the person in or whether they're okay to go, I can feel confident to let them be discharged or take that next step. But I know there's a safety net in place there, so I'm not doing nothing, but I'm not then just saying the default option is I keep them in some time longer, I keep them in a hospital bed. Because lots of evidence suggests if people stay in hospital a short period of time, They fall less often. They're less likely to come to harm. And actually, lots of, particularly in fairly older people, lots of readmissions happen because of deconditioning in hospital and decompensation of other health conditions. So how can we change that mindset about flow and our conversations with clinicians, that quality and good patient safety care and being patient focused and thinking about flow are not seen as being diametrically opposite, but are seen as being all part of the same. So how can we think differently to see thinking about flow and appropriateness of time in hospital as being the right thing for patients rather than the wrong thing? And it's not for me to think about flow. I'm here to think about my patients. It's not my fault you haven't got enough beds in your hospital. I'm here to do the right thing and be the patient advocate. You know, I hear that a lot, but the consequence of that behaviour is lots of people with long length stay in hospital, lots of deconditioning, and then never getting back to their pre-morbid level of function, or never getting home again.
Andrew, just a quick heads up on the 5 minutes to go point.
Okay, brilliant. Just really quickly, so this is some data again from Isa's colleague, not mine. Go on to the next slide, please, about looking at about making criteria to reside work. So this is Jyoti's data that she shared with me a month or two back, just to show this is a real hospital. So in red, we've got people who don't meet the criteria to reside, in green, people that do, and in orange, where there was no data recorded. And so in her trust, over a couple of months, they worked really, really hard to get people using criteria to reside, improving the recording of it. And what you see is what always happens when you start measuring things is the people that didn't meet the criteria to reside, those numbers went up. So the more you focus on something, the higher number of people that don't meet criteria to reside. So when I'm working with trusts, if I see organisations that are really good at using criteria to reside, but with high numbers that don't meet the criteria to reside, to me, that's not always a bad thing. When I go into a trust and they say, oh, we're doing criteria to reside, and all our patients meet the criteria to reside, and they're all sitting in treatment, I think, well, hang on, is this real data? So we would expect there to be significant numbers that don't meet the criteria to reside, and as we get better at using criteria to reside, those numbers will go up. So not to be concerned about that. So this is, if I just talk you through these next slides really quickly, go on to the next slide, please. This is looking at their numbers of admissions. So they didn't change over this period of time, but if you go on to the next slide, when they looked at their discharges, their length of stay, a number of people staying 7 days, they reduced over this time. Can we go on to next slide? Same for 14 days. Next slide, please. And 21 days. And the next slide. And if they look at their bed occupancy. So it does seem, if you start getting clinicians to think about why do people need to be in a hospital bed? Why are they here? It does change our thinking, it does change our behaviour, and it will show an impact on length of stay. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So I think this is my kind of conclusion bits. You know, beds are our biggest expense in hospitals. Do we really know who are on our hospital beds? I don't think we all do. Do we really know which of those patients who are in our beds need to be in those beds? I don't think we always do. And previously with the DTPL list, when we've looked at discharges, we always focused on those that are most stuck, so those really complex ones, rather than those that could go more easily. So using criteria to reside and discharge assess, I think we're trying to think about flow differently and saying, yes, we should still look at those people who have been waiting for quarter protection or something really difficult, but actually we need to know what makes up our day-to-day flow and start doing things differently, and thinking a little bit of that Pareto principle about how do we use that 80-20 rule to say, how can we sort out, do the 20% of the work that gives us 80% of our flow. So particularly, I would say, can we look at when we use criteria to reside and discharge assess, focusing on pathway 0 and pathway 1 rather than those on pathway 2 and pathway 3. We shouldn't not address those, but how do we get our flow happening day to day? How do we make things happen more quickly? So to me, how do we use criteria to reside to make that day-to-day change and our bed flow and our bed management work better, and at the same time do our right thing for our patients about not keeping people in long periods of time, not having unwarranted variation, not having that hospital deconditioning. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So that's me, and I think hopefully I finished on time, Andy, and we can ask some questions. I've seen quite a lot in the chat. I've been talking, but I haven't looked at it. So
yeah, spot on, Andrew. Thanks ever so much for that really interesting presentation. Really interesting. For everybody on the call today, what we will be doing, as I said earlier, is we will share this slide set and share it out. But we've got just under 20 minutes now for a Q&A session. So what I'll do, there's some really good points made in the chat box as well. So we'll capture some of those points and form a frequently asked questions kind of, take a frequently asked questions focus with those and disseminate that. But what we'll do now then, with the time we have left, is take some questions. If we can take the kind of virtual hands up approach, and then I'll invite people in through that mechanism. So any questions?
Can I ask a question? It's Liz here.
Of course you can, Liz.
Hi, Andy. I mean, I thought a fantastic talk. I think very eloquently delivered. I was just trying to work out from a criteria-led discharge perspective the fit, because there's a natural fit. It looks like a pair of shoes that are dying to fit somebody here. And that, we talked about variation. That would be, not that I want to move it onto criteria-led discharge, but I do really see a fit between a decision being made on, yes, they do fit the criteria to reside, and then almost the next question's being, well, what will it take? What are the criteria then? If this is what's keeping them here, what is it going to take to move them on? And I very much love the slide with the therapy, recovery and function on it. So I can, I suppose you could sit here and write sets and sets of criteria, but that wouldn't work in complex settings. So I suppose the question I want to ask is, what would it take to move us forward for the criteria to reside to work with the criteria to discharge?
I think it is saying, well, what's the next step, and how will we know when we've reached it, and what will that look like for the patient? And I think we are bad as clinicians. We have those thoughts in our head. We don't put them down on paper, and we don't let people follow through and act on them, do they? Whether they be nursing colleagues, junior doctors, ward teams, we don't let our patients know. So I think that's the bit about they meet the criteria right at the moment, what needs to happen, and how will we know when that's happened? And I think that's the kind of, rather than just oh yes, we need to organise a CT scan. Well, what's that going to show, and what we're going to do with that information, and if A then B, and if C then D, and those thought processes. And we're not very good, I don't think, at putting those down on paper. And that they become the criteria-led discharge to me. I don't know if anyone else wants to come with any comments.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. John Scott, can I come to you? You've got your hand up. I particularly liked your comments while Andrew was delivering the talk around treating it like a speed limit. I have to say that resonates definitely. Can I come over to you, John?
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm very chatty in the chat box, so
that's good. That's a good thing.
For that. I love that presentation, Andy. Thanks very much for that. There was some absolute gold in there. There was one line right at the end where you said something like, "How did we not spend 588 million of discharge to assess money?" I don't know anything about that, so I think a little bit more info on that would be great.
I think we struggled to, under the Scheme 2 money, I think we struggled to system suspend it all, and lots of systems I work in still had lots of people stuck in hospitals and were not making full use of the Scheme 2 D2A funding, which is why I wrote this presentation. So I don't know, you may be different in East Kent, but I don't think we maximised that. I don't think we took that opportunity of that new funding to double run and get the new systems up and running and really make discharge to assess happen and discharge to assess land. And I think we had a level of inertia, and I'm talking about the general we, and we still tried. And I don't know how you are. I think in lots of places I go to, we're still desperate to go back to the old system. We still want to keep people in. We still want to have medically fit, therapy fit. We still want to do all the assessments in hospital. We still want to make the system run as it used to. And that, well, hang on, this is good for patients. It's good for the system. It's good for everyone in it. I don't think it's been grasped in lots of systems. I don't know how you feel from your system, John. It'd be interesting to hear how you feel it landed.
Well, probably exactly the same, to be honest. And I suspect if you didn't spend 588 million, there's probably more of it we didn't spend it over in this neck of the woods. I mean, I think that whole hospital discharge service document. Find out it was written in 8 days is absolutely incredible, because it's one of the best documents I think I've ever read in my whole time in the NHS. So maybe there's a message there to people who write documents. Don't think about it too much. Good.
To me, if we get it right, it sorts out all those things we've been whinging about for years, doesn't it? People stuck in hospital, not going anywhere, all these delays. Why am I looking after 20 people on my ward who don't need to be in hospital rather than people who need to? It was a really big opportunity, and I'm not quite sure and I accept there's lots of other things going on in the world. I don't think we quite grasped it as well as we could have done as clinicians and people working in healthcare. I think there is this. I found it really interesting to watch that level of inertia about. We complained about the old system, but we'd still like it to go back to that because it's familiar and we quite like it, even though we said we didn't like it at the time.
Brilliant. Callum's posted a message in the chat there for you, John. So the money will be in the post, I suspect. Now, so just going down the questions and the hands up. Alan, you did have your hand up. I don't know whether you've taken that down intentionally. Is Alan still on the call?
Oh. No, yes, I am. I'm Alan Earnshaw. I'm one of the clinicians up in Croydon. I guess maybe the answer's in the question I'm asking, to be honest. The two differences between criteria to reside and community sort of services and in hospital, I guess the glaring thing that looked there was sort of delirium, dementia around, 24-hour need. We don't have as many sort of community beds as I'm sure we would like, and certainly sort of not able to look at that. So I guess so the longer term goal might be to have a community hospital and a place where people can be safe. But actually, when it comes to cognitive impairment, delirium, how do you in your own organisation sort of see that? Because they probably don't fit all of the other criteria, but aren't at the same time safe at home, and it is quite a reasonable sized number. How do other people look at that issue?
I have to hold my hand up and say my thinking has changed, and I used to say these people wouldn't be safe at home, and I ask myself now, if not now, then when? And what would it need to think that they were safe? And I don't know if Jyoti wants to come in, because I think a colleague of hers in the Midlands has done quite a lot of work, particularly looking at that patient group and saying, actually, what if we did get them home with 24-hour support at home? How much better would they be? And is there a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy that when somebody's got a delirium or dementia with challenging behaviour, when you keep them in a hospital which isn't where they want to be, they're much less likely to improve quickly compared to when you get them in their home environment. So if you think differently and say, what would it need to support them at home? Let's give it a go. I think there's been some really, really impressive results, but Jyoti may come back and have some better answers about that.
I'm still exploring that question, Andrew. Thank you for asking me. Yeah, so that's what I get from my, care of the elderly colleagues when I say, what does it take for this person to go home? What if it was there, you would feel safe? They would say if there's a family at home or if there's some 24-hour, because you can have packages of care, but in between the packages is what you want to be assured of that they're okay. So that's almost coming down to 24-hour, temporary care and with night sitters. So that's what I'm really, really exploring. And I'm told that there is no dearth of that, that service. I mean, it's there. You can actually resource that. It's not short of resource. It's just the way social care is trying to access that. I think something needs to change there, and the confidence that the money will be there should be there. So that is what they need. The confidence that the money to fund it is there. And then, but the resource is actually out there. You can commission that service. So I'm exploring that, and I'll let you know what happens.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jyoti. Heidi, I wonder if I could come to you. You've got your hand up.
Oh, sorry, taking my mute off. Yeah, I mean, just in response to what was just said about the 24-hour care, we absolutely can do that in the community, and we are doing some of that in Hertfordshire, but not enough of it. And actually, when you look at the cost of perhaps placing someone with delirium in a DTA bed and the cost of someone going home with 24-hour living care, actually the DTA bed sometimes could be more expensive because of the isolation part. I think the other thing, I was just responding to what John Scott said. I think I absolutely agree. I think the hospital policy has been really good, something, you know, been wanting for a long time. The issue that I suppose we're struggling with is how we embed the culture change with moving some of the therapy out of the acute and into the community. And I think we've moved, obviously, most of our social workers out. Is then moving the moving the therapy out into the community, so we can really offer that speedy DTA process in people's homes.
I think it's really interesting about that, because I think it what you're facing is something we're seeing lots of places, about that reluctance to leave hospital behind. But I think what's really changed in certainly in patients I see since COVID is we used to try and make health policy happen, and we did the hearts and minds of it with staff, and we got staff sign up to it, but sometimes struggled to take the patients with us. And I think we're in the opposite situation now, where certainly the patients I see, they don't really want to be in hospital, and I'm getting asked an awful lot, do I need to be in hospital? Why have I got to be here? When can I go home? And that's changed with older people because of COVID. Even they're still saying those things even though they had their vaccination. So I think it's a really interesting thing. I don't have a magic answer, but it's almost like we've got the patients wanting and their families and carers wanting the change to happen, but we haven't got the messaging right with our staff, and the staff are now making it harder to make it happen, rather than the other way around, where we've often had lots of enthusiastic staff and felt it difficult to change patient behaviours, if that makes sense. I don't have a magic answer. I think it is difficult when you're asking whole groups of staff who've worked in one setting for an awful lot of their professional life to suddenly change how they do things and what they do. But I think it does come back to what's the right thing for patients, and if you bring it back to that, it's really hard to say no, we shouldn't be doing this, isn't it?
Agree. Yeah, thank you.
That's great. Callum, over to you. Sorry, I misinterpreted. Callum, I thought you just put your hand up. Sorry.
Yeah.
Did you want to Okay, over to you. Yeah.
Sorry. I think, yeah, from a therapy perspective, I completely agree with what Andrew's just said there about it being best for patients. And there's lots of evidence out there, especially from stroke ESD in the past through to discharge to assess, been around for the last 5 or 6 years. I think what we're really facing for the acute staff, especially in terms of what their roles are and responsibilities, if we have some data to back up what we're saying, because if I'm a ward therapist or a ward nurse and I want to move someone very quickly when they don't meet the criteria to reside from the acute out to the community, I want to make sure in my head that they're going to be okay. And if you've got the capacity and to meet the demand for the pathway 1 predominantly, then people will feel a bit more comfortable at letting go. I think that's what the message that we're hearing from other people around the country. So if you've got the data to back up what the capacity of your P1 would be in your system, and you've got that matched to what the demand is in terms of how many discharges per week or per month, I think having that solid foundation will really give you the kind of the go ahead from staff to think about, well, actually, if I was out here, then I could support that. And that would be a bit more poignant to the people, because I think they're lacking that. Even though we're telling them it's the good thing to do and the best thing to do, there's still that little bit missing.
Brilliant, great point. Thank you, Callum. Jyoti, I'm just conscious of time. We're just coming to the end now. Jyoti, can I come to you and then we'll go to Mark to close, if that's okay? Just on silent, Jyoti.
Quick question to Heidi Hall, actually. I was interested that they're doing this work on temporary 24-hour live-in carers. Just wondered if there's any evaluation you have done to see whether a day extra in acute to get this 24-hour live-in carers organized is how that compares to actually stepping down into a D2A bed, the cost-wise. I feel convinced we'll probably be better off with the 24-hour live-in carers, but I don't know whether you've done any evaluation, Heidi.
I haven't done any evaluation as such, but in terms of the cost, obviously we know what it costs for DTA beds, and often when someone is going into a DTA bed, because of needing to isolate for 14 days, if someone's walking with purpose, often we've had to fund an extra one because perhaps the care home hasn't had the availability, which obviously puts the costs up, and actually would be significantly cheaper to send someone home with that living care, that wraparound care with them, and also the outcomes are so much quicker in terms of that delirium subsiding. That's what we found, but we haven't done a full evaluation to date.
Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to hand over to Mark now just to close, but it's a great presentation, Andrew, so thank you for that, and some really helpful discussion as well. I think Erica makes a really valid point, and moving forwards with these sessions, we want to use the power of the Alliance as well to kind of push this forward, really. You know, that's the power of this programme of work, really. But great session, so thank you, Andrew, and over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Andy. And again, just to conclude, really, this is another milestone in our A16 journey. It's been really excellent. Thank you, Andrew, for sparing your time, and to you for attending the session today. Our next session is nearly upon us. The fantastic Dr. Liz Lees-Deutsch will be leading us through a session on criteria-led discharge on the 19th of May at 1 p.m. Same time, same place. All of our learning events will be same time, same place. We'd just like to share with you, actually, when we started this program, the emphasis was on co-design. So if you feel there's anything else that would be of any value in terms of reducing in-hospital length of stay, in terms of subject matter, please let myself or Andy know, and we'll actually arrange for that to be part of one of the learning sessions. Please check out our new Future site. It's in progress, but it's looking pretty good. So, just to say, on behalf of myself and the team, thank you very much again for attending today, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.